She died asking for forgiveness, not as someone performing humility, but as someone who genuinely believed she needed mercy. 35 years of life. 21 of them spent inside a convent where she fell ill repeatedly, where she suffered without visible consolation, where the Mother Superior treated her with deliberate severity as a way of guarding her against pride. And at the end, on a sickbed she called her little white place, Bernadette Soubirous whispered, "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for me, a poor sinner." It was April 16, 1879. The woman who had seen the Virgin 18 times, the woman whose testimony transformed a damp rock face in Lourdes into one of the most visited places on earth, the woman who never returned to Lourdes after leaving it. She died asking for what every baptized soul asks, mercy, as if having seen heaven did not set her apart from those who had never seen anything at all. That, in itself, is already a warning. To understand what Bernadette kept, one must first understand where she came from. The Soubirous family was the kind of poor that leaves no way out. François Soubirous, her father, had been a miller, but the mill had failed. By 1858, when the apparitions began, the family was living in what the people of Lourdes called the cachot, a former municipal jail, abandoned as unfit for use, handed over to them because there was nowhere else. A cell, damp walls, 6 people in a space that could barely hold 2. Bernadette was 14 years old, illiterate, spoke only the local Occitan dialect, and had suffered from severe asthma since childhood. By any human measure, she was the last person anyone would choose to carry a message. This, too, is not accidental. Scripture and tradition reveal that God's way has always been to choose instruments that cannot credit themselves with what they accomplish. From Moses, who stuttered, to Mary of Nazareth, who was young and unknown to the world, yet had been prepared from eternity with a fullness of grace unique among all creatures. She was not chosen despite her lowliness. She was chosen, as the angel declared, because she was Kecharitomene, full of grace, the Theotokos, the God-bearer, singular in all of salvation's history. The humble instrument and the singular vessel are not the same thing, even when God reaches for both. Bernadette understood her own place in that order with a disarming clarity. When someone praised her for having been chosen for the apparitions, she answered with a comparison she returned to more than once across her life. Our Lady used me the way a broom is used to sweep. Afterward, the broom is put back behind the door. It was not false modesty. It was a lived theology. On February 11, 1858, Bernadette went with her sister and a friend to gather firewood on the banks of the Gave River near a grotto called Massabielle, Old Rock in Occitan. It was a dark, damp place used as shelter for pigs. When the others crossed the cold water, Bernadette hesitated because of her asthma, and then she heard, not with her ears, she said, but in a way she could not describe, a sound like wind. She looked toward the grotto, and she saw a light. Inside the light, a young woman. Bernadette described her with a consistency that struck everyone who questioned her, bishops, magistrates, doctors, skeptical journalists. It never changed. A young woman who appeared close to her own age, dressed in white, a blue sash, a yellow rose on each foot, a rosary between her fingers. She was smiling, but with a particular gravity. Not the lightness of someone removed from things, but the tenderness of someone who knows them very well. Bernadette fell to her knees and pulled out the rosary she kept in her pocket. The lady prayed with her in silence, moving the beads, but without speaking the Hail Marys, only the Our Father and the Glory Be. When it was done, she was gone. Bernadette remained still for a time she could not measure. 3 days later, she returned. For the second apparition, on February 14th, Bernadette brought holy water. There were those who said the figure might be a soul from purgatory, and holy water would help discern the truth. When she sprinkled it toward the grotto, the lady, according to Bernadette, tilted her head slightly and smiled, as someone who recognizes the gesture without taking offense at the caution. The witnesses present recorded that Bernadette fell into so deep an ecstasy at that moment that it took several men to move her from where she knelt. At the third apparition, on February 18th, the lady spoke for the first time. Bernadette had brought pen and paper at the suggestion of those accompanying her so that the figure might write her name. The answer came without the paper, in a voice only Bernadette could hear. "It is not necessary to write what I have to say. Will you come here for 15 days? And then, almost as an addition, I do not promise you happiness in this world, but in the next." That sentence, it deserves a pause. In the middle of a series of apparitions that would culminate in wonders, healings, and the unveiling of a spring, the first promise the lady made to Bernadette was not of health, not of protection, not of immediate consolation. It was a promise of earthly suffering and eternal joy, as if from the very beginning the Virgin was preparing that sick girl from the cachot, not for an easy life, but for a true one. Bernadette said yes. The apparitions that followed carried messages which the Church, after years of careful examination, recognized as authentic. On February 24th, the 9th apparition, the lady said something that Bernadette repeated to witnesses with a gravity that was not the gravity of a child. "Penance, penance, penance. Pray to God for sinners." And she added a gesture, that Bernadette should kiss the ground on behalf of sinners. Bernadette did it. There, in the cold mud of the grotto, before a crowd that did not understand what it was witnessing, a 14-year-old girl prostrated herself and kissed the earth. There was nothing romantic about the gesture. It was ugly, it was humiliating, and she performed it with a calm that those present remembered decades later. The following day, February 25th, came the scene of the spring. The lady guided her to a corner of the grotto and told her to drink and wash at the spring, but there was no spring to be seen. Bernadette began digging at the ground with her hands. Mud came out. She brought it to her mouth. The witnesses laughed. Some wept from second-hand shame. One of the women accompanying her walked away, mortified by the spectacle. A man standing nearby declared on the spot that this was proof the girl was mad. The following morning, the spring broke through. Today it produces approximately 100,000 liters of water a day. But the apparition that stopped time in Bernadette, in the church authorities, in the theologians who would later examine the case, was the 16th on March 25th, 1858, the Feast of the Annunciation. Bernadette had asked in earlier apparitions for the lady's name. The answer had always been a smile that, according to her, was not evasion. It was almost like someone savoring the right moment for a revelation. On that March 25th, Bernadette asked again. This time the lady opened her arms, looked toward the sky, joined her hands over her chest, and answered in Occitan, in Bernadette's own language, not in the French of the authorities. Que soy era Immaculada Concepcio. I am the Immaculate Conception. Bernadette did not understand the words. She admitted this herself. She did not know what Immaculate Conception meant. It was a theological title that had never once crossed the world of an illiterate girl from the cachot. She repeated the words the entire walk back to the house of the parish priest, Father Peyramale, murmuring them under her breath to keep them from slipping away the way one carries water in cupped hands. When she said them to the priest, he was silent for a long moment. The belief in the Immaculate Conception, that Mary had been preserved from original sin from the very first instant of her existence, was ancient in the Church and widely held across many centuries. But it had long been the subject of serious theological debate. If you'd like to support this work, consider becoming a channel member. You get exclusive emojis, a personalized name with an image of Mary, and early access to videos, and it's cheaper than a coffee. Click Join and be part of it. Great scholastics had disagreed about it, and before 1854 it remained a sententia pia, a pious belief, not yet a defined dogma. 4 years before the apparitions, on December 8, 1854, Pope Pius IX had promulgated the Apostolic Constitution Ineffabilis Deus, elevating this ancient faith to the status of dogma, closing centuries of theological dispute with a solemn and definitive act. A 14-year-old girl, illiterate with no formal religious instruction, had just heard from the Virgin's own lips a title that Latin theology had taken centuries to formulate and that Rome had only recently sealed. Father Peyramale, who had been skeptical and at times hostile toward Bernadette in previous meetings, held his face in his hands for a time that the records of the period preserve without needing to specify its length. What he felt in that moment resists any paraphrase. There were 2 more apparitions after that. The 17th, on April 7th, during which the physician Dozus, a skeptic who had been observing Bernadette with scientific intent, noted that she held her hand over the flame of a candle for several minutes without any burn mark appearing. He recorded this in writing. The 18th and final apparition took place on July 16th, the feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. Bernadette could not reach the grotto. Fences, guards, and municipal measures had been put in place to control the swelling crowds. She knelt on the far bank of the river and looked across the water. She said afterward it was the most beautiful apparition of all, as though the distance had diminished nothing. Bernadette entered the convent of the Sisters of Charity of Nevers in July 1866, 8 years after the apparitions. She was 22 years old. She would never return to Lourdes. It was not a triumphant entry. The Mother Superior, Mother Marie-Thérèse Vauzou, made clear from the beginning that Bernadette would receive no special treatment. At one of the first gatherings with the novices, Mother Vauzou introduced her to the community in words that the records have preserved in substance, that Bernadette was good for nothing, that she could not work in the fields because of her health, that she could not teach because of her lack of education, and that the congregation was taking her in out of charity. Bernadette lowered her head and said nothing. That scene has been interpreted in different ways over the years. Some have seen in Mother Vauzou an unnecessary cruelty. Others, and this seems the deeper reading, have recognized in it something that Bernadette herself appeared to accept: the need to be stripped of every trace of prestige derived from the apparitions. If she was to become a saint, it would be through the common way, through the ordinary cross, not through the extraordinary privilege of vision. In the convent, she worked in the infirmary when her health allowed. She had a sense of humor. When someone asked what her duties in the convent were, she answered with a smile, "My duty is to be sick." But there were moments when illness moved into regions that humor could not reach. She suffered tuberculosis of the bone in her right knee, pulmonary tuberculosis, and a series of complications that kept her bedridden for long stretches. In her final years, the pain was constant, and in the hardest hours, she repeated a phrase that the sisters wrote down with care: "All this is good for heaven." Not like someone trying to convince herself, like someone who already knows where she is going. In 1878, a year before her death, Bernadette dictated a meditation on the Passion of Christ that the sisters preserved. It is not an elaborate theological text. It is the simple language of someone who meditates with the body, with the physical experience of pain, with the memory of her own sufferings. She writes about Christ's abandonment on the cross with an intimacy that suggests something beyond generic devotion. It suggests recognition. This is the point at which Bernadette's life becomes a teaching no book of spirituality can fully contain. She saw the Mother of God. She heard words the Church recognized as true. She was the instrument of one of the greatest Marian renewals in modern history. And after all of that, she spent 21 years treated as the last among the sisters, falling ill in silence, dying at 35 on a convent sickbed with no outward sign of glory. If there is a warning in Lourdes, perhaps it is this, not the warning that spiritual sensationalism seeks, coded prophecies about future catastrophes, dates, apocalyptic events, but a more uncomfortable warning, harder to market, that closeness to the sacred does not protect against suffering, that seeing the Virgin does not guarantee perpetual consolation, that holiness is not an advance reward, it is a crossing. If you haven't yet subscribed to this channel, now is the moment. These stories deserve to keep being told with the care they demand. In at least 3 of the 18 apparitions, the lady communicated things to Bernadette that she never fully revealed. When asked, she replied with a serene firmness that unsettled even the most persistent questioners. "That is for me alone." Bishops interrogated her. The Bishop of Tarbes himself tried gently to draw out the content. She did not yield, not with arrogance, with a peace that those who knew her recognized as something different from ordinary stubbornness. Here, honesty with the listener is necessary. Unlike the secrets of Fatima, whose content was progressively documented and partially revealed by Sister Lucia herself and later by the Holy See, the personal secrets that Bernadette received at Lourdes were not preserved in any reliable written record. No authentic document transcribes what the lady said to her in those reserved moments. Any narrative claiming to reveal the lost content of Lourdes' secrets is, at the very least, speculating, and at worst, fabricating. What exists is Bernadette's silence, and that silence in itself says something. She spoke what needed to be spoken. She transmitted what needed to be transmitted. And she kept the rest, not as the guardian of terrible secrets, but as someone who understood that certain things belong to the relationship between the soul and God, and that no human demand, however insistent, has the right to enter there. The message of Lourdes that the Church recognizes, the one that remains open to everyone, is not obscure. It is there in the records of the apparitions, in the diocesan archives, in the testimony of hundreds of people who watched Bernadette during the visions. Penance, pray to God for sinners, go and drink at the spring and wash there. The word penance, in Catholic tradition, carries a rich and precise content. Sorrow for sin committed, conversion of heart, and the will to make reparation. The Greek of the New Testament used metanoia, a turning of the mind and direction. But the Latin tradition went further, incorporating the dimension of contrition and satisfaction that finds its fullness in the sacrament of confession. The penance that Lourdes proclaims is not a vague posture of spiritual openness. It is a concrete summons to repentance, to confession, to reparation for sins, the same summons that runs through the whole of salvation history. And the prayer for sinners is not a division between the saved and the lost. It is the acknowledgement that we all belong to the same family, and that no one is saved alone. Bernadette lived this from the inside out. The penance Lourdes proclaims she practiced without announcement, on a sickbed, in the daily humiliations of the convent, in the nights of pain without immediate consolation, in the silence she kept about what she had received and chose to carry to the grave. There is a detail about Bernadette's death that the convent records preserved, and it is difficult to read without pausing. In her final hours, she was holding a crucifix in her hands. The pain was severe. At one point, she asked for water. When it was brought, she said, "Everything, everything, everything." The sisters present did not understand exactly what she meant. Then she asked to be helped make the sign of the cross, and then, with the crucifix at her lips, she whispered that final sentence, "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for me, a poor sinner." It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. the same hour at which Christ died on the cross. There is no way of knowing whether this was arranged, not by the dying woman, not by any visible arrangement of providence. But those who know the Catholic contemplative tradition know that time carries a different weight within it. The hour of Bernadette's death appears in several independent documents from the convent. The coincidence exists. What one makes of it belongs to each person's faith. Bernadette's body was exhumed 3 times after her death, in 1909, 1919, and 1925, as part of the beatification and canonization process. The physicians who examined it recorded, in reports that form part of the canonical proceedings, that the body was in a remarkable state of preservation for the time elapsed. The face, in particular, was noted as intact in the reports from the 1909 and 1919 exhumations. It should be said honestly, the face that pilgrims see today is covered by a wax mask applied for public display, but the canonical medical records register a state of preservation that the doctors involved noted as exceptional. She was canonized on December 8, 1933, by Pope Pius V. Her body rests today in the chapel of the convent of Saint-Gildard in Nevers, France. Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims visit the site each year, a quieter number than Lourdes, but no less significant. The pilgrims who come to Nevers, unlike those who go to Lourdes in search of healing, come mostly to look. To see the face of a woman who saw what no theology can fully describe, and who, afterward, did not become powerful, did not become famous by her own will, did not build a spiritual empire. She became, on the contrary, more silent, more hidden, more like the broom she herself had invoked. There is something unsettling about that image for the age we live in, an age in which spiritual vision is immediately converted into platform, into audience, into authority. Bernadette saw the Virgin 18 times and asked to be left behind the door. When someone came to her and said they had traveled hundreds of miles just to see her, she replied with calm, "You should go to Lourdes. There is nothing to see here." Here, in herself, nothing to see. What she meant was something that the entire Christian mystical tradition confirms. The sign points beyond itself. The apparition points to the Virgin points to Christ. Christ points to the Father. Somewhere in that chain, whoever is looking for spectacle loses the essential, which is not visible, not measurable, cannot be condensed into 10 points or 5 revealed secrets. It fits, perhaps, into that sentence murmured with a crucifix at the lips at 3 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon in April in Nevers, France, 1879. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for me, a poor sinner." That is everything. It is enough. It is, in the end, the only warning Lourdes ever wished to give, not about the end of the world, not about imminent catastrophes, but about the only danger that truly exists, living as though that plea were unnecessary. Script based exclusively on documented historical sources, records from the canonization process of Saint Bernadette Soubirous, archives of the Diocese of Tarbes and Lourdes, and documents from the convent of Saint-Gildard in Nevers. The so-called personal secrets of Bernadette have no reliable written record, and have been treated here with the honesty that silence deserves.